So today we're going to be painting our violet floral block. And what we're going to start with is this little wood block, and we're going to put a base coat on there. Our base coat is kind of thick, so you can pretty much get it in covered in one coat. And it's got a nice viscosity that shows a little bit of brush stroke on there. And I'm going to paint around the sides first and just get all around four sides. Doesn't matter which pattern you go, I'm just going linear pattern at the time being with the grain of the wood, but in the end I might go back and cross hatch it or do different patterns. So keep going and get all the sides covered. Kind of put the paint on there liberally, not too much, but just enough where you don't see the wood. And you can see it kind of building up around the corners, and we'll go back in and touch that up in a second once we get it covered. And then again, you can see that kind of cross pattern or keep a linear pattern, whichever you want to do as you're working around the wood panel. So you can see here, just making sure that all the wood is covered up. I'm going to set the block down, and we're just going to finish covering the top. Just cross hatching, nice thick brush strokes, and making sure that all the sides don't have drips or buildups around the corners. And when this block is fully covered, you can paint wet on wet. You don't have to wait, or it dries pretty quick and you can wait for it to dry. It'd probably take about 20 minutes or so. If you had a fan, it'd probably take like 5 minutes to dry to touch. And once I make sure that I've got all of my drips and collections of paint around there, you can kind of see I left a little corner there. Hopefully I remember to get that. And I'm going to start preparing my texture. And so our bags of texture are designed to just be cut open with a pair of scissors or a razor, whatever. And I cut out a hole about an inch and a half, about a half inch or 3/4 of an inch. I'm going to squirt out about a third of the bag, and then I'm going to squirt out on the other palette about a third of the bag. And so I'm going to leave the rest just so in case I get unbalanced with different flowers or leaves, I have more paint to keep going. And so I'm going to take the palette knife with a little bit of violet and just the tiniest bit in there. We're going to make it like a light violet tone on the white. And just because, be careful putting too much in there, because we're going to two-tone the bag so the deeper violet shows through. And you don't have to worry about mixing it thoroughly either. And so to prep the bag, we fold the top to like a collar, and then we kind of open it up like a pouch. And that collar, turns out to be like kind of a handle when you start filling. When we drop the tip in, there's an indentation in the petal, and then there's the rounded edge. Make sure those go in parallel to the sides and not towards the seam, because the seam kind of gets in the way of the bag sometimes. And when we cut the tip, always cut a little smaller than you think, because if you cut the tip too wide, then the tip will actually fall all the way through the bag. So even if you have to force it a little bit, that's okay, because you get a nice firm fit. We don't have to worry about that piping tip falling out of the bag. And so that bag is pretty much prepped and ready to go. You can see it's got a nice open pouch all ready to fill in. And you can see right there how the indentation and the rounded edges are on both of the sides and not on the seam. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take some of the violet and we're going to coat the bag. And we're going to coat, right now I'm starting with like the curved edge, the indented curved side. And that's going to be the inside of the flower. And so if we do it just on one side, that means the flower, when it's piped out, the petal, one side will come out dark and one side will come out light, and it looks kind of good that way. So I'm getting just the inner part, which is the indented part, filled with paint. And so you have a nice coat, and you can see how half the bag, and this is how it nicely lines up with the seams, it's ready to go. And go ahead and wipe off the excess violet off the knife so we don't get too much dark inside the paint we're going to scoop into there. And when we scoop it in, we're just going to kind of just try not to knock all that paint off the side. Just kind of drop it down into the center of the bag so it doesn't disrupt that line. You can see how it's staying separate too. The more neater you are in keeping it separate, the better you're going to have a two-tone pipe with like the inside dark and the outside light. So just keep scooping all the rest of the paint into there. Once you get some in there, it gets pretty much held in place and you don't have to be as careful. And so just getting the last bit of paint scooped into the bag. And one of the important things is once you get the bag filled up, you kind of tamp it down to get the air bubbles out, and kind of just like those drops like that. And it helps get the air bubbles, because if you have air bubbles in there, it'll kind of have these little mini explosions of paint, and you kind of lose the pattern you were intended to do. You see they're just tamping it out, and so you kind of twist the top. And go ahead and practice on the chipboard palette, the tension. It's important that you're going to have these pulses that you're going to be pushing the paint out. You're going to be just these little quick pulses of pushing it out and releasing it and then pulling upward. And just keep practicing that form on the palette before you actually go onto the wood panel. And so now we're going to mix some of the Viridian green into the white. And we're, always start with a little. Don't start with too much because it could get really deep. But this is kind of going to be kind of a deep green. And I'm going to just it doesn't have to be perfectly mixed, but just a nice thorough mix right there. And mixing that green up with the palette knife on the palette, and just keep stirring it around. We have a nice Viridian here, almost ready to go. Then we're going to go ahead and prepare the bag for the leaves as well. And we're going to do it pretty much the same as we did the other bag. We're going to make the collar and, open the pouch and drop the tip in. And the tip on this one is, you see it's lined up flat, and you're going to line up the indention on the flat side, not the pointy part. It just helps to line things up with the seam of the bag. And so once the tip is in, just put it not quite all the way in, so you're going to cut it off. And again, always cut it a little tight so you don't cut too big of a hole and the tip comes out, even if you have to force it out a little bit, just because once you cut the tip too large, then the tip will come out. So it's better to go little cuts at a time to get it right before you cut it too large and the bag becomes useless. And so now that bag is pretty much ready to fill. It's pouched and fluffed out, and I'm gonna make some lines and coatings inside the bag with the Viridian to show a deep tone into the Viridian. So get a nice little scoop in there, and we're gonna line the bag. Kind of just gonna line one side for right now. I'm just lining up around the corner there, and then trying not to get it all over the bag. So just the same as we did with the purple, so we have different, you see two different tones, because when it starts to look monotone, it doesn't look as natural. It kind of looks cool with the dark tone, light tone coming in there. So I'm going to scoop all the rest of the paint in there. Just keep scooping. And again, the same as the other one, once we get the paint in there, we're going to tamp it down to get out the air bubbles. It's just like that drop. And I'm going to... The key here is always twist the bag, so you can get a nice firm pull. If the bag doesn't have a twist on it while you're piping, see here, I'm twisting it, keeping it nice and tight, you won't be able to get that nice pulse of paint out of there. And as you go, you're going to want to keep twisting it, every few, you kind of get a feel for it as the bag gets loose. And right there you can see the two-tone leaf. And practice as much as you need to on the palette, because if you get it right on the palette, you're going to have a much better chance of getting it right onto the wood block. And we're going to scoop that paint right back in anyway. So we're going to start with the center of the flowers right here. And so we're doing two flowers. And so we start like with two centers. We're going to have one kind of diagonally across. And we just start with the center, pulling it up. After each pulse, you give it a little pulse and then pull up and let go right as you're pulling up. Because if you're still squeezing when you pull all the way up, you're going to have these long leafy petals that will look kind of strange. You can see like that last one there was a little longer, but that's okay. But just keep circling around that pattern, working your way from inside out. It's important also when you're putting in the petals to just kind of almost layer them almost on top of each other so they're really close. Because if you have gaps, when it dries, you'll see space through there. So right now I'm going in and filling in any gaps I see for this first flower right here. And I'm kind of building up the center and then working my way out again. It's almost like a second layer of petals all the way around. But just be mindful that you have to have enough paint for the next flower. And I keep working myself all the way around there again. And I'm going to go ahead and, turn the block so it's closer to me. It's up to you, however you work best. But, I get comfortable in certain positions and like it where I can maneuver around it. And so, again, I've started diagonally across with the second flower and just kind of repeating the same patterns over and over again. And again, you can see here up close how those two tones come out. It's kind of cool seeing it like that, and that's why we put the dark paint inside and the light paint, filled in around it. And as we're piping, I'm gonna just keep filling in the spaces around there. So we're gonna come in with the leaf pattern, and it's kind of, if you turn it over, you can see it's darker on one side, lighter on the other side. Entirely up to you which side you want to use, but I really like that two-tone flower there. Sometimes you don't know exactly what you're going to get when you do that, and as it actually pipes out more, it changes. Some of the dark comes out, and so sometimes I get a lot of the dark out on the palette and then I scoop it back in on top. And so basically I have two primary corners, the opposite corners from where the flowers are, and I'm going to just start filling those in these leaf patterns, these dominant corners in the leaves, and doing one side darker by flipping it over, one side lighter to give it a nice contrast. And I'm just filling them out and pulling them out to the edge. They're up and out to the edge. And so I'm just going to go in and fill in any spaces. This is really important in the end, to fill in spaces. If you see spaces, they're going to dry and then leave gaps. So you want to just go in and pop them in and fill them in. It's going to go down a little bit on the edge too. Just give it a little bit of dynamic texture going around it and falling off the side. It's, up to you to keep going as far as you want. So that's pretty much it. I'm just going to check and make sure that it's all filled in everywhere it needs to. If I need to, I can scoop all the rest of the paint into the bag. So I went ahead and got some of the dark paint out because I wanted it a little bit lighter. So that's why I squirt some of the paint out, because it was getting a little dark. And some of that pressure sometimes pushes it out with it. But we're getting pretty close here to finishing up and just filling in the last little leaves kind of trailing off the side right there. And it's up to you. You can put them, you have enough paint to put more leaves in and more flower petals. It's up to you, your restraint